really serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome along, GB News, live on your telly and on your wireless simultaneously. So you can watch the first half of the show on your big screen TV in the living room, and then climb into your car and listen to the last half on your radio while driving through your living room. The choice is yours. Tonight, welcome to post-COVID England, but not so much elsewhere in Her Majesty's dominions. And if you think it can't get any worse, just you wait. That's all coming up. Plus, of course, the most important part of the show, your thoughts live and in real time. Send them along, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or Twitter me at gbnews. All that coming up after the news with Tamsin Roberts.
Mark, thank you. Good evening from the GB Newsroom. Russia has recognised the independence of the breakaway regions of Donetsk and Luhansk in what Prime Minister Boris Johnson is calling a breach of international law. His comments come after Russian state TV showed President Putin signing a decree with the separatist leaders in Moscow. Earlier, in a televised address to the Russian people, President Putin described Ukraine as a US colony with a puppet regime. He also called eastern Ukraine ancient Russian lands. MPs are expected to formally approve moves by the UK government to toughen and expand its sanctions against Russia in response to aggression against Ukraine. The legal requirement to isolate after a positive coronavirus test will end on Thursday in England, and free universal testing will end on April the 1st. Unveiling his new plan for living with COVID, Boris Johnson said all remaining domestic restrictions would be removed, routine contact tracing will end, and school pupils will no longer have to test twice a week. The Prime Minister said the country will now rely on vaccines and treatments to tackle the virus.
Today is not the day we can declare victory over COVID, because this virus is not going away. But it is the day when all the efforts of the last 2 years finally enabled us to protect ourselves whilst restoring our liberties in full. And after 2 of the darkest, grimmest years in our peacetime history, I do believe this is a moment of pride for our nation.
The UK will also offer an additional COVID-19 booster jab from spring for the most vulnerable. People aged 75 years and over, residents in care homes for the elderly, and people aged 12 years and over who are immunosuppressed will be eligible. These groups will be able to receive their additional jab from around 6 months after their last dose. Health Secretary Sajid Javid said all 4 parts of the UK intend to follow the advice from the Independent Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. Just under 30,000 homes are still without power due to the impact of storms Dudley, Eunice and Franklin. That's according to Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng. Some people, particularly in the south and east of England, have been without power for more than 72 hours. Mr Kwarteng told the House of Commons that dedicated teams of engineers are working night and day, with full power set to be restored within 48 hours. Emergency measures have also been put in place to help those worst affected. This is GB News on TV, online and DAB+ radio. Now let's get straight back to Mark Steyn.
Thank you, Tamsin. So Vladimir Putin has decided to go full Justin Trudeau and sees the eastern Ukraine. It's a busy news day. You may just have seen Boris Johnson's press conference an hour ago. As we reported last week, all kinds of places are backing off COVID without end. Northern Ireland, Quebec, New York is postponing its vaccine mandates, and California is moving from pandemic mode to endemic mode, by which it will learn to live with the virus. It's important to note, however, that these are all sub-national jurisdictions. Sovereign states are moving rather more slowly. In America, whoever's got his fingers up the dead husk of a moth-eaten sock puppet that is Joe Biden has decided that their national emergency, due to expire on March the 1st, will be extended. And in Canada, Justin Trudeau has decided he wants to go down in history as the world's first totalitarian mammy singer. As for the United Kingdom, well, Scotland is bonkers and Northern Ireland and Wales are less so. But in England, Mother England is due to be liberated from its COVID regime this Thursday. And that has been devoutly to be wished. He managed to get it past a split cabinet, apparently. Joining me now is the actor and founder of the Reclaim Party, Lawrence Fox. Lawrence, it's great to see you. Is this, to put it in Boris Johnson Churchillian terms, is this the beginning of the end or merely the end of the beginning?
Thank you so much for having me on, Mark. No, I think this is, from what I've been watching today, it's a climb down from the most catastrophic failed public health experiment in history in the United Kingdom. And I am profoundly grateful that the Prime Minister has decided to grow a spine because he wants to get re-elected.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with you on that. We've had guests on this show who have said that with the exception of the first 2 weeks, where, as we saw in northern Italy, there was a serious danger of hospitals being overwhelmed just from the sheer numbers of people going into them, that basically the death count would have been exactly the same from this if governments had done nothing at all. And there have been more in-depth studies to show, for example, that the lockdown on freedom of movement, which is really pretty basic and puts us in the same camp as a lot of countries you wouldn't really want us to be compared with. But the lockdown on freedom of movement in the Western world made maybe a 1% difference to the spread of COVID. So I guess the reason is, why did everybody suddenly agree 2 years ago, with the exception of Sweden, that this was the only way to do things?
I think people were led by fear. They were coerced. We lost our democratic mandate, where we've been run by essentially a scientist, has been our Prime Minister. And I think that what's happened is this is a failed coup in the United Kingdom. And I think that, there's that phrase about kicking the dead dog. This dog is not dead yet. So we need to make sure that every single crime against humanity that has been perpetrated by this regime and other regimes around the world, ongoing in Canada, is never, ever to happen again.
Were you disappointed to see, I don't know whether you saw the Prime Minister's press conference, but he was flanked, as usual, by his highly knighted scientific advisors, Whitty and Vallance. And they weren't quite on board with him as far as the whole end of COVID thing is. Would it have been more? Would it have been healthier if they hadn't been standing next to him?
I think that public policy should be dictated democratically by Parliament. And we've seen over the past 2 years that Parliament has been superseded by what we call so-called experts. And these experts are going to have to be answerable to ONS data over the next few years. And I think we're just at the very, very beginning of what is going to be a revealing of one of the biggest attempts to reorganize society in history and to turn what was once a former and liberal West into into China, which is what Canada is attempting at the moment. And I would actually ask that the United Kingdom removes Canada from the Commonwealth immediately, along with Australia and New Zealand, because I think that this is a disgusting misappropriation of what freedom and democracy is. That's how I feel. I feel that the sentiment. Sorry, you go.
No. Carry on. I'm interested in that because the Commonwealth to date has been the dog that didn't bark, and there's certainly an argument to be made that if Robert Mugabe started by doing what Justin Trudeau has been doing this last week, and eventually the Commonwealth suspended Zimbabwe's membership. Are you surprised by the silence of Trudeau's fellow prime ministers in the Commonwealth?
I think it's abhorrent. I think it's utterly abhorrent the way that our Prime Minister has tried to deviate and move ourselves aside onto a conflict in Ukraine which has nothing to do with us whatsoever, and that these peaceful protesters in Canada are being treated as terrorists. They're having their bank accounts frozen. And I think what we're getting is a glimpse of what the future looks like if we allow authoritarian regimes in the name of liberalism, who are actually fascists, and I would call Justin Trudeau a fascist, and I would call Jacinda Ardern a fascist, and I would call many of the leaders of the various territories in Australia fascists, and that we're witnessing the rise of something that we've seen many times before. And I think that I stand with every single freedom fighter across the world who is asking for nothing more than the right to protest peacefully against what are beyond imagination authoritarian measures.
Yeah, it's interesting what's happening in Canada. If you happen to just make a $50 donation to this truckers convoy, as many people in the UK and the rest of the Commonwealth did, then they are taking a lady in, I think it's Chilliwack, British Columbia. She can't go out and buy a quart of milk. She can't go out and buy a loaf of bread. Trudeau has frozen her bank account, and there is no, under these emergency provisions, there's no means of redress for that. You can't even go and petition the great dictator, the father of our nation, and ask him to have mercy on you and restore your bank account. The Emergency Act, so-called, makes no provision for that. Extraordinary.
Well, it's very dangerous. It's a dangerous trend in democracy, really, that what's happening is emergency acts are being used to bypass democracy. You've got things like COP26, which are globalist acts that they're not run past the British people or any other sovereign nation. That the people of this country and the people of other countries have the right to peacefully protest. If you cannot peacefully protest and you do not possess bodily autonomy, you are not free. You are a slave to the state, and you are a vassal of the state, and you are essentially China. It's China. I have terrible fantasies about what I would like to happen to Justin Trudeau, but I pray that I won't have them for much longer.
Well, it's interesting. There is a general trend. I described it as a move to a post-democratic era. And people are concerned about this. They note that, for example, the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, at the exact same time as she is the Queen's Deputy First Minister of Canada, also sits on the board of the World Economic Forum, which one would have thought would be a conflict of interest. But you do get the vibe that there's a small, tight group of people who are the only people who matter, and if necessary, the views of people who actually do things and help your society keep running, like those truckers, are of no importance.
I couldn't agree more. And I think the last 2 years have demonstrated that there are honest traders in this world. There is a man that sells you an apple in a greengrocing shop, and he has been banned, or she has been banned, so I can be gender equality or whatever I need to do nowadays. But small and medium-sized businesses have been destroyed by this pandemic. And what we have to do is we have to reclaim a sense of the fact that you have autonomy over your own life. And if you don't have autonomy over your own life, your life means nothing. and your children's life means nothing. And I'm amazed and astonished that our cowardly Prime Minister is trying to politicize his big climb down today. If you listen to it, what's being created in our minds is this cognitive dissonance. We're free, but we're not free. Vaccines, this whole idea that a vaccine was a sterilizing influence in life. Look at Louis Pasteur and look at these people that really sat down and created science, and now we're being told that we're rolling out a fourth and a fifth booster in various places on Earth. These are not vaccines. These are excuses. And what's going to happen in time? Look at him, Boris. I'm sorry, I'm watching him on your screen wearing a mask, in between glasses of champagne. It's very. I'm a lover of language, and I believed as a child that a vaccine was a sterilizing vaccine. I understand you get a booster for tetanus and all this sort of stuff, but the idea that we're going to roll out vaccines and throw in experimental drugs into people's bodies without any long-term data whatsoever, I think is utterly reorganized society in a terrible way. And I do not like the way that our government are behind it, and I don't believe that our government are actually behind it. Actually, I think this is. It runs much, much deeper than that, and I'm worried. I think everyone in England is going, "Oh, it's brilliant! It's it's the end, it's the beginning of the end," and I'm like, "No, it isn't. This is the end of the beginning."
Yeah, that sounds just about where it is. Would you care to make an estimate as to the moment when Nicola Sturgeon will give up her role as COVID commissar for the Northern Kingdom? Right now, we seem to be in a situation where England and Northern Ireland have recognised COVID fatigue and are backing off, whereas Scotland and Wales are not there yet. And that seems slightly odd to me.
Well, Scotland and Wales and England have always had a very complex relationship throughout history, haven't we? So, there are reasons why Nicola Sturgeon is stoking difference with the with England, and there's reasons why Mark Drakeford, in between growing not avocados, what they called courgette on his allotment, are trying to deliberately wind up Britain. Now, look, I think Boris Johnson's ultimate aim. He was a libertarian. I wish and I pray to God that Jeremy Corbyn had won the 2019 election, because I would have thought that we would have seen a Conservative turn around and say these measures are unbelievable, they're unconscionable, and they are unreliable. And what should have happened really is across the world, we should have seen what's beginning to happen in England today. But I think that what will happen ultimately is that we are at the beginning of a very, very, very long fight. And we're at the beginning of a fight to stop ourselves becoming controlled by central bank digital currencies, by digital ID, by incomes that expire after a week. And I think that we've started to worship China. And also the worst part of this is I've got a friend who started up a company, and he said to me, come out and have lunch with me. I earned £40 million this morning. And I went, what's your company called? And he said, Wonga. And then I Googled Wonga. Yes. And he goes to Davos every weekend. He's not a friend of mine anymore. Yeah. Well, whenever they do Davos.
Yeah, no, it's true. All the you're not important if you don't get that big Davos invitation. Although what you were saying, Lawrence, I take your point of view about how a genuinely conservative opposition would have pushed back. The silence of the loyal opposition in Ottawa on all this has been very telling. Thank you very much, Lawrence Fox. It's great to see you. We're going to get to your views next. GB Views at gbnews.uk, or you can tweet me at GB News, plus Alberta Premier Jason Kenney on a terrible week in the senior Dominion, and Lionel Shriver, best-selling novelist, on more horrors ahead. We're not like the BBC and Sky. We're happy to talk about topics they go nowhere near. So stick around.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hey, let's get straight to your comments. Bruce says, contemplating liberty in England from Thursday on. Bruce says, might travel to England to feel free. I think he's a denizen of Nicola Sturgeon's Scottish Free State, to coin a phrase that no one would believe. So it might even be Robert the Bruce if he's still around. If not, it's Bruce the Robert. Might travel to England to feel free. But Toofy, fabulous name, Toofy, a little goofy, but I like it. Toofy says it will be just another day. Kelly says it's not real freedom. Coronavirus legislation is still in place. Yeah, that's the important point here. That they're temporarily forswearing the use of their emergency powers. But the emergency powers, 2 years into the emergency, remain in place. Millie says, I'm living exactly how I've been doing for the last 2 years. That's either extremely good news or extremely bad news. I hope it doesn't mean that you're only taking a half an hour out of the house every day to do a bit of exercise and being chased by the coppers if you go into a Costa too far from home for your macchiato. Thank you for those. Keep your tweets and emails coming. Stump the Steyn will be on deck imminently. I've always been a great believer in the Westminster system. That's the governing system the United Kingdom lives under, and so many of our friends around the Commonwealth, as we were talking about with Lawrence Fox. Unlike most other systems, in times of great stress through the last century, it has mostly held. But the 2 years of COVID have not done it great credit, and this degeneration reached its nadir a week ago in Ottawa in the decision of a hitherto ludicrous Bollywood bridesmaid to suspend Parliament and give himself power to freeze your bank account for donating $50 to anybody who opposes him, as we were just talking about with Lawrence. When Robert Mugabe carried on like this, the Commonwealth denounced him and eventually suspended Zimbabwe from membership. But when Justin Trudeau does it, oddly enough, everyone stays silent. In recent days, we've invited Canada's High Commissioner in London, that's Justin's pal, Ralph Goodale, the Commonwealth Secretary-General, Lady Scotland, and the Minister of State for the Commonwealth in Mr. Johnson's ministry to appear on the show, and all are, so far, very shrinking violets. As far as I count, internationally, only Donald Trump, plus a Euro MP from Romania and a backbench Tory at Westminster have condemned Trudeau. Also the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, who scoffs at Canada, quote, "Are these the people who like to give lessons to other countries about democracy?" That's rather well put, actually. In Canada, the national opposition, as noted, has been extremely muted, but provincial premiers are pushing back. Among them, Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, who joins me now. And it's great to have him on the show. I preferred the old name, Jason, the War Measures Act, because it seemed to me more honest about the action you were taking. But we have to call it the Emergencies Act these days. So let me ask you straight out, is there an emergency in Canada?
Well, no, there's no emergency that requires invoking, you're right, Mark, the successor legislation to the War Measures Act, which effectively was martial law. Viewers may know that, or you certainly know, that back in 1970, the War Measures Act was invoked by Prime Minister Trudeau's father to deal with some militant and violent Quebec separatists. It's broadly regarded as a great shame in our modern history and a huge overreach at that time, which is one of the reasons Canada developed its written Charter of Rights. This, I believe, is a clear violation of the principles of that charter. It is not called for, it's disproportionate, it's unnecessary. Look, I'm a law and order conservative, and I don't think any democratic government can tolerate indefinite blockades of critical infrastructure, of roads, of border crossings. We dealt with that here in Alberta effectively using ordinary powers. We don't need these extraordinary powers to deal with people parked illegally on a road.
Well, as you've mentioned, the Canadian Charter of Rights, which was Justin's father's gift to the country. I recall that when you were actually immigration minister, you stopped handing out the charter to new citizens, and if I recall correctly, started handing out Magna Carta, which is a rather older charter and not one cooked up by Justin's dad, because you wanted to remind new Canadian citizens that their freedoms, their liberties, have very deep roots that go back way further than 1982. A lot of Canadians seem stunned to find out that despite the words in the Charter, apparently one man can just send out a tweet announcing that all those liberties are suspended and he's now proclaimed an emergency. There's a little bit of a conflict between those two things there, isn't there?
I think there is, and the Act itself requires that, in effect, to paraphrase, that no ordinary law can deal with an emergency situation. It contemplates widespread armed insurrection, a failure of the state, when really what we were dealing with was a few dozen trucks parked on downtown Ottawa streets, which could have been dealt with using using the regular rules of the road and regular policing. Here in Alberta, we had a situation where there was a 2-week intermittent blockade of our main border crossing with the United States. It was a real problem, causing some economic damage and inconvenience for lawful travelers and truckers. But our provincial police service here, which is the RCMP, dealt with that using their normal powers. They didn't have to resort to conscripting tow truck drivers, using extraordinary legislation and they didn't have to freeze people's bank accounts. So this is overstep. But to track it back, Mark, the immediate cause of all of this was the Prime Minister putting in place with President Biden a bilateral mandate for vaccination for truckers going across the border. You know full well we don't have full grocery stores in Canada without U.S. grocery imports. This was done just a few weeks ago as Omicron was on the decline. This was nothing but bad political theater. It was political science, not public health science, that led to that, which really triggered a series of events. And I think they've layered even more bad politics on top of a situation that they helped to create. And by the way, there's no doubt that some of the folks involved in these protests have extreme views, but I think many of them, most of them, frustrated Canadians who simply wanted to speak out against 2 years of damaging restrictions. And the Prime Minister effectively has called almost all of them Nazis. And this is, it further inflamed an already combustible situation.
Well, you're now taking this to court to see if we can get a judge's ruling on this. You regard it as disproportionate, and you also say that if this is allowed to stand, I mean, you mentioned the business half a century back, but in fairness to Justin's dad, the UK Trade Commissioner in Montreal had just been kidnapped by Quebec separatists. There was actually a Quebec terrorist movement, not terribly impressive by the standards of others, but it nevertheless did exist. Here, the Prime Minister has compared ordinary truckers, Polish bakers who bring them donuts in the morning, and all kinds of other people. He's basically invoking this act by comparing them with terrorists. Are you confident that a judge will see it that way?
Well, as you said, our provincial government will be filing a court challenge to this federal invocation of the Emergencies Act. And I think there's a possibility that 1 or 2 other provinces will join us. I can say that 7 of the 10 Canadian provinces have spoken out against the invocation of the Emergencies Act, saying that it is not necessary, it's disproportionate, and it's unjustified, and that it creates a dangerous precedent. That is certainly our view. We don't think it meets the legal definition of invoking this extraordinary legislation. So we will be taking that to court, as are groups like the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And I think if you just read the clear letter of the law, that the federal government will have a very hard time defending that this was absolutely necessary, that they could not restore order through normal legal means.
Are you disappointed, as many Canadian Conservatives seem to be, by the comparative silence of the official opposition in Ottawa? I know that one of the consequences, the first immediate consequences of the Canadian truckers was that the leader of the opposition got defenestrated, and so you've got an acting leader and all the rest of it. But they do seem to have gone along with things that seem very iffy, such as the suspension of Parliament on Friday.
Well, I'm not sure I entirely agree with you on that, Mark. I think the federal Conservative opposition has been very strongly opposed to the invocation of the Emergencies Act and to the Prime Minister's provocative language. But the real shocker here is Canada's Socialist Party, the NDP, New Democrat Party, which apparently will be voting in lockstep in favor of this extraordinary use of emergency powers. You'll recall back in 1970 with the FLQ crisis that then leader Tommy Douglas, who's kind of a folk hero in Canadian political history, said that this was like using a hammer to crush a peanut. And the NDP then were principled and consistent champions of civil liberties. And they've completely caved to Justin Trudeau, which is, I think, a shocking about turn for a party that used to be principled on these issues.
Well, we've talked about the other parties. We haven't talked about the Bloc, actually. Oddly enough, from my chums, they're the separatist party in the Canadian Parliament, and they're always quite reliable on these things because their go-to is always, so the Anglos are doing this to those guys. If we let them get away with it, they will do it to us in 6 months' time, and that seems to be generally their approach on those kind of rights issues. But let me talk about the cabinet itself. Oh no, go on then. Yeah, go on. Respond to that.
Yeah, no. Look, obviously, I disagree with the Quebec separatists on the federation, but they are resolute defenders of the Canadian Constitution, which means a federation and respecting provincial jurisdiction. One of the other problems with the Emergencies Act is it clearly intrudes into provincial jurisdiction for ordinary law enforcement. And any Quebec government, federalist or separatist, would fight that to the end.
Okay, let me ask you what I was working up to there. You've sat in cabinets, and anybody who's been in healthy cabinets under our system of government knows there's a broad range of opinion. You know, Boris Johnson just now didn't get to make his statement until hours after he'd planned to, because he had some difficulties getting cabinet to go along with him. So in that sense, that seems slightly healthier than Justin Trudeau's cabinet, where no one seems to disagree with him on this.
Yeah, I'm not sitting inside that cabinet, but your observation seems reasonable. I think that he helped to create the situation with the trucker vaccine mandate, which was completely unnecessary. By the way, Mark, we have currently tens of millions of people in North America with active COVID Omicron infections. The notion that a few thousand unvaccinated truckers who could be asked to take a rapid test, sitting in the isolation of their truck cabs, would constitute a public health menace is ridiculous on the face of it. This again, and this happened when most of Canadian provinces were, and U.S. states, lifting public health measures. This was done for one reason, I think, because the Prime Minister successfully campaigned against Conservatives on COVID policy in the last election. This was, again, political theater. He created the irritant and then added fuel to the fire with intemperate words about the protesters. And now, again, I think this is a theatrical response to all of that. This is hugely irresponsible. And I would have, again, I would have thought that after the FLQ crisis, the War Measures Act of 1970, that there would be some cooler heads around the Liberal government that would say, hold on, is this really a responsible path for us to go down?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the War Measures Act, World War I, big deal. World War II, big deal. The FLQ, the Quebec crisis 50 years ago, not something that ever needed this. But on the other hand, it looks like World War I by comparison with Justin Trudeau's invocation of the Emergencies Act. Now, I wish you the best of luck with this lawsuit, and we will certainly follow it, because there are dark days ahead if the governing party gets away with this. It will do it again, and other parties will do it again, and other countries in the Commonwealth will start doing it too. And it will be a terrible precedent if allowed to stand. Thank you very much, Jason Kenney. It's always good to see you, and we will follow that lawsuit closely. Keep it on GB News. Stump the Steins coming up. Ask me anything. You can Twitter me at GB News. And if you don't go for a maple-flavoured strongman, Lionel Shriver will be here on an alternative mode of societal collapse. Don't touch that dial.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Coming up on Dan Wootton Tonight, to mark the UK's Day of COVID Liberty with all restrictions finally being axed, I launched the Dan Wootton Tonight Lockdown Inquiry, probing the mistakes and injustices of the country's pandemic response while the government dragged their heels. First to give evidence is Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration, who'll be investigating whether more lives and livelihoods would have been saved had we adopted focused protection from the start. Plus, positive Professor Carol Sikora and the man who's gone viral for exposing the horrors of lockdown, GB News star Neil Oliver, deliver more COVID reason. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News.
As we've been mentioning, the national debt of the United States government recently crossed $30 trillion and barely made the papers, even though the almighty dollar is supposed to be the global reserve currency, which is a strange thing to be saying about an entity that is more debt-ridden than any other in human history. Tales of dystopian futures tend to be predicated on extraordinary events: a nuclear apocalypse, a fascist takeover, an Islamic takeover, a patriarchal fundamentalist Christian takeover. But maybe the doom that actually awaits is way more prosaic than that. We're broke and running on fumes. Lionel Shriver is an international best-selling novelist. She's lived in London for many years because she fell in love with a British subject. About half a decade back, she published a novel called The Mandibles, set in an America after the collapse of the dollar. It's a great book, and you should read it because a couple of things it predicted have already started to happen. Lionel joins me now, and Lionel, you returned to your theme in a recent column for The Spectator. You think something really bad is about to happen really soon.
I keep running into people who have read The Mandibles, and they take me aside and say, "It's happening, it's happening, you were right." And the irony being is I don't want to be right.
No.
Economic collapse is not, it's only fun to read about. It's not fun to go through. And I wrote my last column for The Spectator about one of my favorite subjects, which is debt. And I'm of the view that capitalism does not function with zero interest rates. We have incentivized the worst possible kind of economic behavior, and therefore we get lots of it. And so everyone's in debt. Every sector is in debt, and debt is going through the roof. And why shouldn't it? It doesn't cost anything to borrow money. But what we've got now is central banks are terrified of raising rates even a tiny bit. You know, the Fed rate is still 0.08%. It's gone up in the UK to 0.5%, which they think is now enormous. But if you raise the rates even a little bit, suddenly you've got all these mortgage holders who bought houses they couldn't really afford, and you just raise it a little bit and suddenly they can't keep up with the mortgage payments. It's even worse for government. That if you raise rates just a little bit and the US government has to pay almost nothing rather than nothing on that $30 trillion, the deficit goes through the roof. I mean, we're in a debt trap. Yeah. And I don't know how we're going to get out of it.
No, and what's fascinating to me is that, in a sense, in the last 2 years, most of the rest of the West has headed off in the same direction as the US. I mean, the UK and Europe have now taken on COVID debts that they're going to be paying off, if they ever do, for a century, just as we did with our debt in the Great War, which was finally paid off a couple of years ago. So that moves us a little bit closer to Washington. Then when you're in Washington, you realize that a complete lack of interest in this $30 trillion debt, you can, if you ever bring it up with an American politician and you look in their eyes, it's of no interest to them. It's unreal. New Zealand paid off the entirety of its crown debt in the beginning of this century, and Canadian Liberals paid down their national debt in the 1990s. But everyone in Washington thinks, well, we blew through 30 trillion. What's the difference with 40, 50, 70 trillion?
I think the thinking runs now that because we've been getting away with murder for so long, that means that it's possible to get away with murder indefinitely. And I don't believe that's true. I do think it's true that we don't know when the limit is reached. It's impossible to say. But we saw in 2008 how quickly everything can fall apart. I mean, in days. And so we're not going to know what the limit is as to how much debt we can take on before the entire system falls apart, until the entire system falls apart.
That's a good way of looking at it. You know, I said at the beginning that parts of and as you've said, readers have come up to you and said your book's coming true. But one of the things there is that what replaces the dollar is not another currency, but a so-called basket of currencies that the rest of the world agrees on, leaving America out. And we're actually already seeing that. The Chinese and the Russians and the Saudis have periodic get-togethers on this. At some point, it's going to suit the Chinese to yank the rug out from under the dollar and end it. What do you think comes after that?
I'd say it's anyone's guess. The one thing that we can be sure of is it won't be pretty. The U.S. has been skating along on this reserve currency business, and that means that lots of countries de facto use the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. is spoiled, and it makes it's possible to generate all this extra money and not necessarily have to pay the piper. I think that you would see high inflation. And we've already got high inflation. The thing with inflation is, if you think that it's mostly a concern for billionaires and everything who have lots of money, and then suddenly their cash is falling apart. But it's really a concern for everyone. I mean, if you have anything, it starts being frittered away. If you have any kind of pension, then you are highly concerned about inflation. And for that matter, if you have a pension, you have to worry about the stock market. And if we end up having to raise rates a little bit because inflation's going through the roof, you're going to see a huge tumble in the stock market, if only because a massive proportion of investors, especially in the U.S. stock market, have bought their stocks on leverage, meaning they've borrowed the money to invest. And again, why not? Doesn't cost anything appreciably to borrow the money. So, the idea is because people think now that you can't lose in the stock market, which it only goes up, apparently. So you borrow up to the hilt and then you make money hand over fist. But what happens when the stock market starts to slide is that suddenly all these people who have borrowed money, they get margin calls. They make movies about this stuff, right? Which means you have to pay the money back. And that means you have to sell the stock even if it's not at an advantageous time. And this sets up, and then it keeps going down. There are more margin calls, and the stock market can plummet. So all this stuff is interconnected. And frankly, I find the entire international monetary system so fragile, so perilously interconnected, so horribly based on a worldwide debt of 256% of global GDP. It shouldn't work at all. It should have fallen apart a long time ago. So, one of the main reasons that it continues is that the alternative is so terrifying, and we have no choice but to have faith in it. But because the international monetary system depends on confidence, on our belief in our currencies, that belief is very fragile and can be destroyed in a day.
Yeah, we believe in it because if we stop believing in it, then we're like Wile E. Coyote in Looney Tunes and we just plummet to Earth, and it's not going to be sweet when we land. Now, you said they make movies about this. It's unusual in literary London to find a novelist who wants to write about this. It's a sort of subject that can accept in the destructiveness of what it does to people's lives that could seem very dry. Why do you think that all the clever people who make the decisions for our world, not just in government, in bureaucracy, in central banks, the guys who get together at Davos, do they know this is happening and just don't wish to address it? Why is no action taken?
I think it's not sexy. It's not climate change, so it's not trendy. The same people who are ignoring it also have a big stake in the system continuing to be propped up. So it's also about money. It's interesting to me that novelists tend to ignore this particular form of apocalypse, because of course apocalypse is a favorite subject matter. And the number of climate change novels you can't even count. But there are very few economic apocalypse novels. To me, the terrors of economic disaster are much more immediate than climate change, and much more likely. We're not talking about 2100.
No, absolutely not. And the other thing that has happened in the last couple of decades is that we have made ourselves more dependent on central control of these things. Well, as we're just seeing in Canada, the Mounties pass a list on to the banks, and the Royal Bank of Canada and the Bank of Montreal and all the rest close those accounts because our financial strength exists in large part on the internet and can be accessed by a lot of people. We carry far less cash than we ever used to. Some countries have moved off checkbooks completely. In other words, just in our ordinary lives, we've made ourselves more vulnerable to a major central event such as this, more so than they were in, say, Germany in the 20s.
Well, I think what's going on in Canada is a reminder that we have all made ourselves at risk of the state seizing our assets. And that's what happens when things go seriously south. They'll just take it. As a matter of fact, it's still on the books that the U.S. government can seize your gold. And that's what happened in the early 1930s. FDR just took everyone's gold. That's something that very few people remember. It's not taught in school. It's one of the weaknesses in relying on gold as a backstop. I've got some gold, everyone will want my gold. Well, not only can you not eat gold in a state of collapse, but the government knows where most of the gold is. If you buy gold, they know it, and they can legally seize it from you. And the truth is that now that we have all digital everything, they can legally seize everything. I mean, it's
everything, yeah.
It's forbidding.
And that's advanced quite a lot since the last crisis, when Greeks were driving, Honda Civics full of cash north to Germany to put in German banks. Americans, the US government isn't going to let Americans do that. That cash isn't walking out of the country. In fact, even back at that time, my assistant was stopped on the interstate driving to pick me up in Montreal. And there were roadblocks just shy of the border in which they would stop you and check whether you had $10,000 in your car. So nobody's going to be taking any of whatever you have got. You're not going to be able to walk that out anywhere. Your book had a hopeful ending.
That's one of the first things that happens in the mandibles is capital controls.
Yeah.
So you can't take any more than $100 out of the country. And by that point, of course, $100 is worth about 5 cents.
Yeah, it's a terrific read, and you were ahead of it. And as you said, it's a lot more than the exotic apocalyptic visions that the other guys seem to be writing about. Thank you, as always, Lionel Shriver, and we should heed her warning, folks. Good to see you again. In our closing moments, let's get to a couple of your questions. Do you think there's any truth in the Great Reset, says Jobane, or is it just for tinfoil hat wearers? No, you should really just take these guys at their word. They wouldn't go through all the trouble. If you look at that video that Klaus Schwab and the Prince of Wales quite disgracefully made together about the Great Reset, they're telling you what they're going to do straight up front. So unless you want to call them liars, let's just take them at the word. The Great Reset is a thing, and it is going on right now. Papignon says, since economic measures literally apply to thousands of accounts, only the forbearance of the Canadian government, RCMP, prevents them from being frozen with a single call to a bank. The fact that the measures are technically subject to the Charter is no protection. The process is the punishment. Yes, and the important thing to bear in mind is that nobody you know will ever want to give to a protest like this again, because none of them want to end up by having their current accounts frozen. That's basically the beginning and end of it. And that is basically the end of our show, but never fear, the one and only Dan Wootton is going to make your Monday for 2 swinging hours. Stay safe, stay free.
Good evening. Storm Franklin may have cleared away, but the weather remains pretty lively. We're going to see a spell of heavy rain sinking south quite quickly during tomorrow, and further strong winds throughout this week, although not as stormy as last week. The most recent storm, Franklin, has cleared away. A brief bump in the isobars, bringing many a fine evening. But here come the next set of weather fronts. This already introducing cloud and patchy rain to Northern Ireland. That'll trickle into western Scotland. Further east with clear skies, those winds ease off. Turning quite chilly out there, but actually temperatures tending to rise as we go through the